Okay, cool. So, gonna try and move a little quicker here for to get to the main bulk of this. So again, the thing we kind of left off on is when we're thinking just purely at the level of natural language, surface grammar isn't a very isn't always a good guide to underlying logical structure. The White King and Alice's discussion here about nobody is a nice example. Another familiar example we talked about, we had the example from doing definite descriptions with the present King of France is bald, or the present King of France is not bald, right? You might initially read this, in fact, it's kind of natural in a certain way to read this as having a basic subject predicate form. That is, we have the present King of France as a subject, and then just a simple predication, that thing is bald, right? And this, of course, leads to trouble since, well, there is no present King of France, so the sentence somehow kind of misfires. It's not really true or false. This especially was problematic when we thought about the present King of France is bald and the present King of France is not bald.
Would you say it's an empty predicate?
So importantly, being bald is definitely not an empty predicate. But it's something like an empty singular term.
Yeah, so I was thinking like being bald or like bald being the subject and like France.
So importantly, here we're restricted by the grammar of even the natural language, right? So natural language isn't going to let us read the is bald here as the subject, right? Just because of the way the grammar there works. But I like the idea, right? It's already suggesting something, and that is, okay, it's the English level grammar that's the problem. It's the natural language expressions that are getting in the way here, right? And actually, we know how to deal with this sentence, right? We just read it, and the best way to read it, much like Russell taught us, is not as a straightforward subject predicate, but as a sentence with a quantifier involved, right? It's something like, we paraphrase this. We read it as, there's exactly one thing that is a present King of France, and that thing is bald. And now we know why it's false. It's false because there is no such thing. It's not that there's exactly one, there are none. So the at least part fails. Again, this kind of gives us a way to treat some of these sentences. Yeah?
It didn't have to be true, right? In reality.
Yeah, it didn't have to be true. But again, we're just thinking about, right, how to understand this sentence. Because if you just read it flatly, it looks like it requires, even for the kind of sentence to have any meaning, that there's some dude that is the present King of France. That's bad. Right. And if we just say, oh, it's false, and the one with the negation inside is also false, then we potentially undercut the idea that there's no gaps. Remember, our assumptions way back, no gaps, no gluts. Every sentence is either true or false. No sentence is both true and false. This would look like if we said it and its negation are both false, we're into either gaps or gluts, one way or the other.
It's the case that this sentence, like the present King of France, could either be neither true nor false because we don't have an object.
Because there is none, right? It's like, does Santa wear a red suit? Oh, no. Does Santa not wear a red suit? Oh, no. But that doesn't mean that there's a kind of gap about Santa talk. It's just, no, in both cases they're false because there is no Santa Claus. Again, don't want to ruin any people's. Sorry for the people in the recording too. Yeah. So again, Russell's suggestion is we paraphrase, right? And again, we've done this. We did this a bunch. This was how we actually helped ourselves figure out how to symbolize things, right? We paraphrased in English until we kind of got to a point where the logical structure was more transparent. So this is all set up. Because we can obviously pull the same kind of thing with the exchange between Alice and the White King, right? So I see nobody on the road. Right? Well, we can paraphrase Alice's claim as something like, it's not the case that there is something I see on the road. Obviously, it's very poetic, right? but we're not really concerned with poetry here so much as just absolute rigid clarity. This spells out the logical structure of Alice's claim in a very clear way, and when you do it this way, there's no room for the White King's pun. Because there is no space for nobody to be ambiguous between a name and some kind of quantifier phrase. Yeah.
So for my own clarity, it's a comparison between saying Rn versus negation existential XRX.
Yeah.
Okay, and for the other one, with the present king friends bold, that's existential KX conjunction BX versus BK.
So remember, right, if we're doing the definite description, there's exactly one. So there's at least one, there's at most one, and it's a B. And it fails because there's not even at least one thing that's a present king friends. This is the thing. We turn what looks like a subject predicate sentence into a quantified sentence when it starts with the existential, and then the failure of the existential is why the sentence is false. Okay. So all of this is a setup to finally get to Quine's method. Again, we needed this sort of background about paraphrase to help us get clear on what Quine's going to do. He's going to give us a tool to figure out ontological commitment, a method, an approach. So Willard Van Orman Quine proposes this general method for understanding or settling commitment issues. And again, the kind of big things that he's after, the two kind of aims. How do we tell the commitments of a given theory? What are the ontological commitments of some theory? We don't care what kind of theory. Like what are its commitments? What does it say are out there? And then this more general thing of how do we do ontology? Again, we can turn this question into a version of that by asking about what's the commitments of the perfect theory. So, according to Quine, ontology is about what there is. He jokingly puts it, a curious thing about the ontological problem is its simplicity. It can be put in 3 Anglo-Saxon monosyllables. What is there? And the answer is easy. Everything. Done. What is there? All these things. Everyone will accept this answer as true. But of course, it's not the full answer. Because the follow-up is, cool, what is in everything? When you say everything, what's in there? As he puts it, there remains room for disagreement over cases. So, thanks, Quine. Let's try and unpack exactly what he means. So his method is designed to catch ontological cheaters. An ontological cheater can either be a theory or an individual who expresses a theory, right? Who spells out what they believe is true, which we can then treat their commitments as a theory. So a theory is a cheater when it professes to be not committed to something, but turns out to be. So the idea is, it's a cheater if and only if it says, hey, I don't believe that there are any Fs, but then when you unpack the theory, it requires that there are Fs. It is ontologically committed to there being some things that are F. Yes? Yes. So again, an ontological cheater is someone or some theory that professes that there aren't any Fs. They say, okay, you know what? I don't think there are any of these things. But then when you suss out what their theory is committed to, they've got to have them. So, an easy example, and we'll talk about some in a few minutes. Suppose you want to be a really staunch materialist. You don't want to believe in anything that's abstract. Okay, so you say, I only think there are abstract objects, there are no things that are, I only think there are physical objects, there are no abstract. If it turns out that their theory requires the existence of abstract objects to be true, they're a cheater. Because they said there are no abstract objects, but it turns out their theory requires that there are some. We'll talk about it, right? So, see the process. The idea, the way we're going to make this work, the way that Quine's method works, turns on this thought first. Existence, this comes back to something we were talking about earlier. Existence is not expressed with a predicate. Instead, existence is communicated via the existential quantifier. Again, we already were using this idea. How many times do we talk about, hey, if you hear there is, how do we treat it? We read it as an existential, right? The man said it earlier. So if I want to say Alfred's human, cool, I can use the name and the predicate is human. If I want to say that Alfred exists, I say there is something in the domain that's identical to Alfred. Existence is expressed using the quantifier, not a predicate. Now that's Quine's assumption, like lurking in the background here. And he's going to use this to give us a method. So, when does a theory or an individual commit themselves to something? Well, I'll read the quote and then we'll talk about it. Right? We can very easily involve ourselves in ontological commitments by saying, for example, that there is something which red houses and sunsets have in common, or that there is something which is a prime number larger than 1,000,000. But this is essentially the only way we can involve ourselves in ontological commitments, by our use of bound variables. To be assumed as an entity is, purely and simply, to be reckoned as the value of a variable. Or as it's often re-expressed, Quine's view is to be the value of a bound variable. Now let's unpack this idea, right? What is it to exist, according to Quine? Well, to be in the domain and have an existential scope over you. Alfred exists, according to this claim, because he's got to be in the domain. The existential grabs him and shakes him around and says, this is Alfred. So, when do you commit yourself to there being, say, redness, the thing that red houses and sunsets share? If you say, there is, existential, something shared between these two things. That is, you quantify over redness as an entity. When do you commit yourself to Alfred? If you existentially quantify over Alfred. Existence is expressed via this existential.
I don't get it.
Okay, so again, the thought is, when does a theory commit itself to an entity? A theory commits itself if, when you unpack it, the theory includes sentences like, there is a blah, blah, blah. Why am I going to end up being committed to there being abstract objects? Because I am committed to a sentence that when we look at the structure says, there is this abstract object. For Quine, this is the only way to express ontological commitment. You turn out to have to say a sentence with an existential, one of those existential quantifiers in the front, is true, and hence I am committed to the existence, because that's how you express existence, of whatever it quantifies over. So this is, So this is, again, the core idea of Quine's view. Existence is expressed via the existential, right? And the only way that you get yourself involved in ontological commitments is you commit yourself to the truth of sentences that use the quantifier, the existential quantifier. So you might wonder, and this comes back to something we were talking a little bit about, right? Why not use it with names? Why not have existential commitment or ontological commitment be via the things we have names for? Well, first thing, this is Quine specific, Quine actually thinks that names are eliminable. Quine thinks that you can replace all proper names with definite descriptions. This is something we'll talk more about when we get to how names work, how proper names work. But the second reason is, it seems pretty clear that we can sometimes be committed to things despite not having names for them. Think about plate tectonic theory. Plate tectonic theory didn't have any names for the various plates. It's not like, oh, this is Steve, and this is Bobby, and this is Susan, right? It just says, there are plates. They do this. Like, it's a silly point, but it's important, right? Because names are one thing, one way to pick out things in the domain, but it is not the only way. So this is one reason why we should think more about using the quantifier. So existential commitment, according to Quine, is quantifying over that thing. So per Quine, one is ontologically committed to there being Fs, if and only if what you claim entails existential X, Fx. And ontological cheaters, to again kind of clarify, an ontological cheater is someone who says, hey, I don't think there are any Fs, but when you unpack their theory, it turns out they're committed to a sentence that quantifies over Fs.
So it can be the case that the theory states that there are no objects, but in reality there are objects.
So importantly, again, what we're not worried about is what's in reality. Right? We're just worried about what is the theory committing itself to. So the theory might say, hey, there are no Fs. And then as you unpack all the sentences, all the things the theory says, turns out that one of the sentences the theory says is true entails, and this is why they're cheaters.
Yeah, within the theory.
Within the theory. We do not care about what the world is really like. We're just thinking about what is the theory committed to? What does the theory say exists? And they're cheaters because they profess that they do not believe or they are not committed, but they are. They're ontological cheaters because they say, hey, I'm on a calorie-light diet. Oh, cool, what are you eating? Fucking cheeseburgers? Amen, right? But it's a diet Coke, so it's fine. So, okay, here's Quine's method. This gives us a way to capture cheaters. This is Quine's method in 3 steps, basically. First, you decide what sentences the theory takes to be true. Right? So basically, this is, here are the sentences the theory states. If you want to think about an individual, right, you just take, these are the things they believe. So you write them down. They're going to be in a natural language. Right? English, Dutch, German, doesn't really matter. Second step, we regiment these sentences into what Quine says is canonical notation. That is, what you do is you take the natural language and you reformulate it into something like FOL. Doing this captures and expresses underlying quantificational structure. So it's taking the natural language, it's eliminating any ambiguities, there's the word I was looking for, ambiguities that might be in the surface grammar, getting it clearer by formulating it into a formal language, especially a formal language that has the existential quantifier, and then finally, read off the commitments. What does the theory have to have in the domain in order for the sentences you picked out in 1 to be true? So 3 steps. Take the sentences that the theory says are true, reformulate in some canonical notation in, say, FOL, and then look at the FOL sentences and see what needs to be in the domain. What does the theory quantify over? Again, what we're not concerned with is, are there these things out there? We're just thinking, what is the theory committed to? What does the theory say there are? Yeah.
So does regiment means reformulate?
Yeah, regiment just means kind of, so it means strictly speaking like put in good formal order. For our purposes, what it means is translate or symbolize into FOL.
Okay, so
So again, take the natural language sentences, re-express them in first order logic, read off what it's committed to. Those are the 3 steps.
Please go through the 3 steps with us in an example.
Yeah, I've got 3. right? So, before we get to the examples, we'll come back to it, yeah?
Yeah, actually, also had another question.
Sure.
Before that, it was about the cheaters, because I still don't really understand the cheaters with the
Okay.
application.
So it might be easier to think about it in an example, right? So we'll come to, when we get to the examples, it might be drawn out a little easier. But the basic idea of a cheater is someone who says, hey, I don't believe in any of these things. But when you unpack their theory is committed to the existence of these things, right? I don't believe that there are any abstract objects. Oh, but your theory is committed to there being numbers. And numbers are abstract objects. Ah, crap, right? I guess I'm a cheater. I said there were no abstract objects, and it turns out I'm committed to there being some after all.
Because the concept of an abstract object exists, so you can use it.
Yeah, it doesn't matter about the concept, right? The thing, these abstracta, whatever the hell they are, need to be in the domain. I quantify over them. Another easy example. This is one we'll talk about in a few minutes. So there are some weird materialist reductionists. They say, hey, the only thing that exists are fundamental particles, leptons, quarks, neutrinos, things like this. What do we say about this table exists? Oh, crap. Looks like I'm committed to there being more than just the little tiny fundamental particles. If they say this table exists is true. So that's the kind of thing that you could catch them in. Easy example. Again, suppose we've got a reductionist. You ask them, what did you have for lunch? Oh, I had a ham sandwich. My dude, ham sandwiches are not fundamental particles. You're committed to the, I had a ham sandwich for lunch. You're committed to ham sandwiches. You're a cheater. That's the kind of idea. Again, it's a silly, jokey example, but I hope that the kind of core concept there is clear, right? So, thing to note, regimentation is essential to this methodology. That is, the move from natural language into something like a formal language is required. And this is required because the implications and entailments of our theoretical claims are often obscure. Surface level natural language grammar isn't a good guide to logical structure. By pushing it into FOL or something like it, then we get the grammar clear. The logical structure of the sentences is laid out in an unambiguous way. Here's a very silly test case. And in fact, we basically used this earlier, right? There's Vulcan again. Right? Vulcan's theory includes sentences like, Vulcan causes Mercury's retrograde motion. Again, it doesn't really matter. But we can take that sentence, which was expressed presumably in French, and Barry wrote it, but it's fine. And we can regiment it, and note now it requires that there is something that is a Vulcan, that vulcanizes. And it turns out to fail, because in this case, we go out and look in the world, nothing satisfies this predicate. There is no such thing. So we get the commitment of the theory is that there is something that's a vulcanizer, and then it turns out that the theory isn't true, because, well, when we look out in the world, nothing does that. Vulcan's an ontological commitment of this theory, because when we regiment a sentence from the theory, it quantifies over some object that is a vulcanizer. That is a planet in between Mercury and the Sun, You see the idea?
So this is not a cheater, right?
Not a cheater, right? A cheater would be somebody who says, I don't believe in planets, and then says something like this, and Vulcan has to be a planet. That would be a cheating. So, a central issue here is the question of how we do regimentation. Yeah.
I have a question about the last slide.
Please.
So, Vulcan causes Mercury's retrograde motion. Doesn't that also imply that there's just one thing that is Vulcan and just one thing that's Mercury? So it shouldn't be.
Yeah, this would need to be much longer and clearer.
Okay.
Again, but all that matters is this initial bit, that we have the existential, And it's that existential, plus whatever else we do, it doesn't matter. That existential is the thing that's causing our commitment, right? That causes this theory to be committed to Vulcan. So yeah. If we're spelling out this sentence, it's going to be a lot more complex. Right? Yes?
Okay, one last time for Titus. So what you just explained. Could you maybe give me an example, because it still doesn't really click in my head, an example which is with say for example the FB doesn't exist, but for FB doesn't exist you need to say negation existential X fx. Is that it?
Yeah, right. So importantly, hang on and let's get through some of the examples. Maybe this will spell it out, because I think a lot of the examples center around trying to show that some theories are cheaters.
I'll just come back after.
Yeah, that might be better. So again, the methodology. Take the sentences of the theory that are supposed to be true, regiment them into some kind of formal language, read off what it quantifies over. 3 steps. Core issue, how do we regiment? Here's one of the things we can do to help ourselves out. We paraphrase. This is why we did this as a second, right? And paraphrase is also really useful if it turns out that on the surface level, you're committed to something you don't want to be. Here's a joke example, but I really like it. For heaven's sake, don't do that. Now, let's just set aside the things about the kind of normative aspect here. Just take the first part. For heaven's sake. Okay, one thing to note is this seems to require the existence of sakes, whatever the hell those are. And you might wonder, well, I don't want to be committed to a sake. So obviously what you do is you say, okay, this is just a fast and loose way of talking. What I really meant is something like, I strongly suggest you shouldn't do that. The for heaven's sake was just a turn of phrase. Now we're going to do this kind of paraphrase strategy to get out of apparent commitments. Take the present King of France is bald. Right? One of the things we can do with that is we paraphrase that. It's not, there is a thing that is a present king of, or sorry, it isn't subject predicate structure. We paraphrased it into the quantification. And then because the quantifier fails, we know that's why the sentence fails. So again, this is something we can kind of see a little bit better as we think about some examples. Now, one limitation when we're thinking about paraphrase is that you have to preserve truth conditions. So that is, right, our paraphrase is true if and only if the original is too. If the paraphrase can be true when the original isn't, or vice versa, we screwed up. So let's look at some examples to kind of get a feel for this. And I suspect this might draw some things out a bit more. Right? So here's a lovely, lovely, lovely debate. It's very silly, wonderful paper from David and Steffi Lewis, right, about the existence or non-existence of wholes. You know, wholes. Right? So suppose one's a thoroughgoing materialist. You only believe in physical objects. As they put it here, you don't believe in intellects or spirits or auras or deities or other things unknown to brute physics. So our materialist only wants to commit to things that have mass and occupy space-time. This is how they characterize their materialism. Again, we don't care about whether they're right, just care about what are they committed to. So our materialist only wants these things. Notably, one entailment of this theory is that there are no such things as wholes. Because wholes don't have mass and they don't occupy space-time. They are gaps. Right? Gaps don't have either of those things. Right? You get the idea? So, cool. Problem. Our materialists will often say things like, there are holes in this piece of cheese. So how can our materialists say this? Because it looks like on the surface, this requires that there are some holes. So our materialist doesn't want to believe that there are any such things as these weird gaps, but they say stuff like this, which seems to require that there are things like holes. Again, we see the kind of weird, it's a silly example, but hopefully do we see the example, right? So what do they do? What's our materialist do? Well, one thing is you could just deny that this sentence is true, right? You could say that, no, it's not true that there are holes in this cheese. Right? And then, of course, what you do is you take the cheese away from them or ask them how they tied their shoes. And then they say things like, oh, I laced the lace through the hole. Oh, fuck. Again, it seems like we'll be able to catch them in some kind of talk that involves holes, quantifies over them. I suspect you're already going to push what they're going to do, right? So, what can the materialists do in response? Well, they're in a pickle, a cheesy pickle, right? Bad joke, sorry. Right. Because they're committed to there are no holes. That was something they wanted. But they're also committed to a sentence like there are holes in this piece of cheese, which require the existence of holes. So the solution is to paraphrase hole talk. I know. So when we have there are holes in this piece of cheese, we read this instead as this cheese is perforated. Which doesn't require quantifying over anything like a hole. It just requires quantifying over cheese. Do we see the idea, right? So by paraphrasing this into this piece of cheese is perforated, you only quantify over cheese. And then it has some properties, namely the property of being perforated. Cool, we get out of the problem. By paraphrasing this way, our would-be materialist seems to avoid the commitment they didn't want. They're not being a cheater. But of course, we can press them further, right? Because the materialist needs a systematic paraphrase. That is, it's cool if you just go one by one for each sentence, but there's a hell of a lot of sentences they're going to have to make sense of. And notably, if there's even one sentence purportedly about holes that they take to be true, thank you, I know it's a bad joke, like one holy sentence that they take to be true that they can't paraphrase away, then they're a cheater after all. If there's even one that entails the existence of the whole, then they're in trouble. Right? They've committed themselves to something they didn't want to. They are a cheater. And there's a bunch of different ways we can do this. So we can say something like, there's a hexagonal hole in this piece of cheese. Well, cool. We paraphrase this as, this piece of cheese is hexagonally perforated. Okay? How about, there are as many holes in my cheese as in your cracker?
This cheese has many perforations.
But that's not going to give us the exact same number.
And I think those-
There are as many holes in this cheese as there are holes in your cracker.
This cheese is as many times perforated as your cracker is perforated.
Yeah. Either my cheese and your cracker are singly perforated, or doubly perforated, or triply perforated, or quite, you see the idea. Right? It's hideous. So this paraphrase is neatly ontologically parsimonious. We never end up having to be committed to the existence of holes. But Jesus Christ, is it semantically onerous. Saying these things have the same number of holes suddenly turns out to be requiring you to have a whole lot, of perforation predicates. Right? Because each one of those is going to have to be a different predicate. So again, the idea here is this materialist, the anti-holer, can get away from their commitment to holes. The way they do it is by paraphrasing the hell out of their sentences.
What was prima facie?
Prima facie means on the face of it.
I know it's an example, so it doesn't have to be true, but like, theorists can just easily counter it by saying that we're going to ignore third party words.
Yeah. So one of the things you get to then is if you start thinking about it as like what's inside the hole, then you don't actually have holes anymore.
Well, that's why it stands. That's you're ultimately committed to there not being holes, right? So you say that the cheese is not that hole.
So we get a fun thing is if we go with this route, it's very hard to make sense of this kind of talk. So again, we'll need something like perforation talk again to help us with counting and things like this. But yeah, there's other ways to go. The important thing here is again to see the example of how they get out of being a cheater. Right? They seem to be a cheater, and then they get out by paraphrasing. Here's another one. We talked about this already. I have some friends who actually buy this kind of view. They're reductionists. They only think that there are fundamental particles. These are the only things that exist. Everything else is just combinations of those things. So the problem with this kind of view is that there's lots of everyday speech that we take to be true that seems to require everyday objects. Right? So I use brown in the slides, but we can talk about this table is gray, this podium is gray, right? This table has, in this case, 2 legs, right? These seem to be true, but if we take them to be true, it's very hard to then maintain this position. So how can you maintain reductionism and still buy into the truth of these kinds of sentences?
Because what would be a fundamental particle?
So something like a lepton or a quark, anything like this.
And like trying to have your everyday life, as you said, speaking in terms of quarks and atoms.
Yeah,
That would be like the aim of the reduction.
That would be the idea, right? So what is there? Just these things. What's out in the world? Only these fundamental particles. And the challenge then becomes, how do you make sense of these purportedly true everyday claims? Now, of course, one option is just to say, I don't think it can be true. That's a view. Right? But that's a really bad view. A nicer option would be, can we find a way to keep these true?
So couldn't you just see like table as a nickname and just say table effectively states this particular pile of Latin quotes?
Exactly. So what we'll say is, right, instead of this table is brown or this table is gray, we'll say something like, this collection of fundamental particles arranged table-wise is gray.
Yeah.
Right? Again, just really poetic language, tripping off the tongue here. So why this kind of move? What's the idea here? The move is to try and just end up only quantifying over fundamental particles. Because the thing that the existential would range over is collections of particles. That's perfectly fine in their view. Yeah.
But then you still believe in gray. And gray is how is it?
Yeah, so what we might do is gray and brown, we could talk about maybe reflecting light of such and such wavelengths, right? There's further paraphrasing that we might need to do. Right? So yeah, importantly, all this does is get us out of commitments to tables. Doesn't necessarily get us out of commitments to everything yet, but we can keep the paraphrase machinery going. Right? Now, this is just a lovely, slightly silly, but useful way to avoid commitment. And what we do is we basically postulate lots of weird XXXYs predicates. Podium-wise, telephone-wise, chalkboard-wise, right? There's a hell of a lot of these fundamental particles that are all arranged XYs. But importantly, all that we ever quantify over, which is the only way to express existence, will be fundamental particles. But again, the problem here, the testing, is that there's even one table sentence that they cannot adequately paraphrase. Then they're going to end up committing to tables after all.
Sorry for the question. How would your friends paraphrase another form?
Yeah, so I think what they would do there is kind of go with, when we think of things like number, what we're really doing is counting physical objects. Right? So what 4 is just a different way to talk about collections of these things, or these things, or these things, or these things, or these things. 4 turns out to be a set.
4 is made up of elementary particles.
That's okay, right? Because we could reduce all of that down. So 4, talk of 4, turns out to not actually be quantifying over anything like a number. To say 4 is a number, really what we mean is you can count with this term, blah, 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 that kind of thing.
What if we're like that play of Sims and we're all zeros and ones? Then still in Sims there are also tables.
Yeah.
There are still zeros and ones. So
Good.
it could be here also.
Good. So remember, again, what we're not trying to do is ever say that these theories are true or false. We're just seeing what's the theory committed to, right? So if you had a sim philosopher wandering around and they said like, hey, you know what, I think that all there really is are zeros and ones, and one of the other sims was like, my dude, what about this table that I put in my bathroom here? And he would say, yeah, cool, you mean this collections of zeros and ones arranged table-wise? Again, this would be exactly the kind of move. Again, what we're interested in is thinking, what are the commitments of a given theory? There's a different question about, are those things out there? What is the theory committed to?
So it stops at the point that it becomes like, zeros, ones, or
Whatever the theory says, right? All we're interested in is, hey, by your own lights, are you committed to everything that you say you are? Are you not committed to everything you say you are? That's really all we're after. Let's do one more example, right, real quick. This one is one that I'm very interested in. So fictional character talk. Fictional characters are paradigmatic non-existence. That is, Poirot and Columbo, while wonderful, do not exist. If you rounded up all of the detectives in the world, you're not going to find Poirot and Columbo. They're just not there. Sad, but true. So, the problem with this kind of view, this anti-realism about fictional characters, the denial that they exist, is that it seems to run afoul of a lot of our talk about them. Columbo is a detective. That seems true. Columbo is a milkman. That seems false. So how do we make sense of these? How do we make sense of the truth of Columbo as a detective and the falsity of Columbo as a milkman if we want to say that Columbo doesn't exist? They both should be false. So one thing we can do is we can paraphrase the claims. We say, hey, Columbo is a detective. This has an implicit in the Columbo films, in the Columbo show. Baked in the front. You don't hear it in the everyday English, but it's there. You think about the logical structure. That's why it's true. In the Columbo stories, Columbo is a detective. That's true. The story says as much. In the Columbo stories, Columbo is a milkman. That's false because the story doesn't say that. And what's nice about this is it only commits to the existence of stories. It doesn't commit you to the existence of Columbo. So this is the initial kind of anti-realist paraphrase view. Right? Again, avoids commitment to characters by paraphrasing it as just commitment to stories. Yeah.
For example, let's put the case that I write a story where my first chapter is also named Columbo, and I write Columbo is a milkman or someplace when my Columbo, for example, is. My question is, how do you know
Good.
the Columbo you are referring
Good.
to is the same Columbo as I don't know?
So there's questions about interfictional character identity and all of these kinds of things, right? We can talk about the canonical Columbo stories rather than the fan fiction Columbo stories. That's what we mean by in the Columbo ones, right? So again, that's kind of implicit here, right? We can worry about how that's fixed. Yeah. So there's a whole slew of questions about interfictional identity, right? But we can again just say the canon ones, whatever those are. So here's the problem with this kind of view. There's a whole host of claims that don't look like we can do this paraphrase for. Holmes is more famous than any living detective. That seems true. That's not true according to the Holmes stories. That's just true. Right? There are characters in some 19th century novels who are presented with greater wealth of physical detail than any character in any 18th century novel. That looks true. Unfortunately, that also isn't paraphrasable according to some story. That just looks true. Another one is if you compare a real individual to a fictional character. Arnold is stronger than Frodo. Looks true. Doesn't look true vacuously because Frodo doesn't exist. It's just no. Right? Frodo looks less strong.
So you can make comparisons with like the real world and the not so.
Well, we make these kinds of claims all the time, right? And the problem is when we make these kinds of claims, it's not true according to the story.
No.
And that's why this paraphrase of it according to the story doesn't seem to help. So the challenge here is that our everyday fictional character talk seems to say that the would-be characters don't exist people are cheaters. They accept that sentences like these are true while denying the existence of characters. Hey, give us 1 minute. So again, the general thought here is using this methodology to figure out the commitments of a theory. We take the sentences the theory says are true. We regiment them into a formal language, and we read off what does it quantify over. That tells us the commitments of the theory. Again, we're not worried about whether those commitments are really out there. What does the theory commit itself to? And the test, what we're looking for, is does the theory say, hey, I'm not committed to some things, but then when you unpack its sentences, it turns out that they are. To be committed to both of these, that is what it is to be an ontological cheater. You deny that there are any Fs, you turn out to be committed to them. Okay, so what we'll do on Friday, right, during the tutorial, as I said, we'll do the exam inspection. So I'll have the exams, I'll hand them back and look at the sample answers and things. We'll talk a little bit more about some of this ontological commitment stuff. We'll finish up the last little bit that we didn't get to do, right, on some issues and problems with Quine's approach. And we'll talk about some of the response questions that are in the assignment. Cool? Thanks for coming, guys.